This weekend's shipwreck video is a bit of an interesting one. An experiment of sorts in making a compilation of existing material. Admittedly, this is something I've done before. The old Leyte Gulf, Crossroads, and Midway videos, for example. Those were different in being dedicated compilations from the start. This video will be combining existing material. My 4 Japanese submarine wreck videos from the end of last year. Why those 4? Well, there's 2 reasons. First, they're all related. 4 Japanese super submarines sunk off Hawaii after being surrendered. And secondly, they're all very close together in release date. That's mostly important because it means the quality of the videos matches up pretty well. Other cases, not so much. There's quite a bit of difference in my early wreck videos compared to the later ones, to say the least. Still, I think this is an interesting experiment. Hopefully, people will pop in to take a look, since it will consolidate 4 very interesting wrecks in one location. Now, with all of that said, let's start things off with the smallest of the submarines. The speedy little boat I-201. At this point, we'll be swapping to the old material, though I will change things up a little at the start and end of each respective video. I-201, the most advanced submarine built by the Japanese in the 1940s. This boat was designed with one thing in mind, and that was underwater speed, coming out to around 19 knots when submerged. For the 1940s, this was very fast, faster even than the 15 knot surface speed, theoretically a very capable design. Unfortunately for the Japanese, development took too long. I-201 would never see combat. Ultimately, she would be captured in port by the United States, and after extensive study, sunk off the coast of Hawaii, where the wreck was eventually discovered in pieces decades later. Let's briefly touch on how she got there, and then look at the wreck itself. I-201 was launched on February 2nd, 1945. By this point, the Japanese fleet was a shadow of its former self. Only one major action remained in Operation 10 Go. Of course, as a submarine, I-201 was not assigned to that operation. Instead, she spent her entire time in service on testing duty, with the submarine based in Maizuru on August 15, 1945, when the Japanese surrendered and the war came to its end, even if the formal surrender ceremony didn't come until September 2nd. At this point, I-201 was seized along with other Japanese submarines. The Americans had a particular interest, as you could expect, in the fancy new boats. Submarines like I-201 or the big carrier submarines, such as I-14 of the Type AM design, and the I-400s even larger than that. All of these boats would be put through extensive testing over the following year. In I-201's case, she would have a rough time. First, a battery fire on December 11th, 1945, and then an engine failure on January 26th, 1946. Nonetheless, the boat would eventually make it, albeit under tow, to Hawaii on February 13th. She would not be there long. On March 23rd, 1946, I-201 was expended as a target, sunk by a torpedo from USS Queenfish. There's actually footage of that sinking, which I'll link in the description. Her wreck was largely forgotten at that point, a victim of early Cold War tensions as the United States destroyed all advanced Japanese submarines to keep any knowledge of their capabilities and design out of Soviet hands. It wouldn't be until 2009, fairly recently, that the wreck was located. The Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory found I-201 on February 16th of 2009 during a search operation that also located I-14. Both submarines are at a depth of around 800 meters or 2,625 feet. I-201 was found in two pieces. The bow broke off during the sinking, falling well away from the main hull. You can almost make that out in the footage of the sinking. Despite that, the boat was remarkably well preserved when she was located. The submarine's designation and a Japanese flag and chrysanthemum were still visible on the conning tower. The flag in particular as bright as the day it was painted. In addition to that, the submarine's deck still retained much of its wood. We'll be looking at that in this video, of course. However, before that, one final note. Last year, as of this recording, Nautilus returned to the wreck. Despite being 14 years later, not much has changed. The most notable difference was some marine growth on the conning tower and fading of the paint. With that note done, let's move on. This will be a mix of the original footage and the Nautilus survey. I'll also link the video they took in the description. As for the wreck, we'll start with the most distinctive part, that being the conning tower. This was very streamlined as part of the effort for greater speed, something that remains apparent even after decades underwater. The tower narrows a lot towards the front, and even when it widens out, it's not by much. While we're at the front, there's also some interesting details. The windows being the main one. That's not a common thing on submarines from this time period, and it makes the conning tower look almost like a Soviet submarine. As for the general condition, well, it could be worse. 800 meters is not shallow, but it is on the shallower end for a deep-water Pacific wreck. In spite of that, there's not as much deterioration as you might expect. It's rusted, certainly, but some of the paint is still there, and the marine growth isn't terrible. And of course, the windows are intact. Now, the tower doesn't look as good from above. The rusting is worse, and it's covered in strands, what look like fishing lines. There's not a lot of detail to make out, but you can see the periscope here, along with holes in the top. Those are structural features, but I can't say for sure what purpose they served. We can see them better here. Not perfectly, but better. So let's move on to the side of the conning tower. First, we have an older image from the first survey. This shows far less fishing lines and a less overgrown structure. The imperial chrysanthemum is also visible. The white paint has started to yellow a bit, but not to the point of being unrecognizable. Unfortunately, the picture doesn't show much else, other than a cleaner periscope and a bit of the lower part of the conning tower, which we can see much better here. It's still not the best picture of the bunch, but it's a useful comparison for later. Here we have a nice side shot showing three things of note. First, an open entrance into the tower, with an intact ladder beneath it. Second, we have the I-201 paint, clear as day. It hasn't faded much and is completely legible. And third, we have the Japanese flag. This has been covered up a little, although still not by much. It's in worse shape than the name, but probably about the same as the chrysanthemum. The rest of the conning tower, meanwhile, matches with the other pictures. Very little marine life, and generally in decent shape. That remains the same when looking from a lower angle. There's not much to add other than a better look at the ladder and the flag, both of which are important when we move on to Nautilus. Now, as we look at this, remember that 14 years passed between the surveys. There's definitely signs of the aging here. The paint on the I-201 is in rougher shape. There are very notable splotches where it's being covered up, slowly but surely. The same goes for the crest on the upper portion of the conning tower, as well as the flag, which has definitely fared the worst here. It's heavily faded, with the red starting to wash out, especially on the sun rays. Moreover, the white paint has started to yellow, and this isn't even touching on the marine life growing on it. I'd say the flag is probably the best demonstration of the time gap, with the general increase in rust, including the worst condition of the latter, coming in second. This look from further out gives the best look at the full conning tower, showing the streamlined shape once again. However, that wraps things up here. The next area is the hull. Most of this is going to come from Nautilus, starting here with the stern. This shows a couple things of note. First, much more marine life. It's growing on the dive plane and the prop. That dive plane is actually an interesting design choice. At the time, it was far more common to be on the bow. It's also angled slightly, likely pushed up by water pressure as the boat sank. If you watch the sinking footage, I-201 went down very quickly, so that wouldn't surprise me. I'm also not surprised to see the rudder on the center line. The boat was empty and a target, so it only makes sense to keep her straight and level. More interesting, I think, is the overall condition. The stern doesn't show major damage, and the prop shaft is firmly in place. Actually, both of them are. We can see both props in this image from the original survey. It's poor quality, however, so there's not much else to say. That said, a bit further along the boat, there is some damage to the stern. A split in the side here. This was definitely a result of the sinking, although it's not clear if it's from impact with the bottom or from something else. The same goes for a hole in the pressure hull directly beneath the conning tower. This is a pretty large gash in the side that you can see here from a distance, and much better here from closer in. There's scattered debris inside, and you can also see the rough texture of the hull. This is not torpedo damage, or at least not direct damage. The sinking footage shows the impact was further ahead of the tower, and this hole is too small to be from a direct hit. If I had to guess, the torpedo hit roughly where the bow broke, which we can see here. It's actually a remarkably clean split considering the damage I-201 suffered, especially when you look at the sinking frame by frame. Actually, I'll put up what I mean here, and this image is before the bow dropped away or the worst of the explosion. Regardless, the hulk on the bottom isn't terrible. There is bent and broken metal towards the top and the bottom, but the overall condition is still decent. You can see inside the hull, and the shape of the submarine is still recognizable. That's even more apparent here. According to the Nautilus video, this is roughly where the battery compartment would have been. If so, you can't actually see any of the batteries, just more twisted metal. The boat looks much worse here. She's still recognizable, but the damage is worse. When you look at it from above, it doesn't get prettier. The hull is split and torn, with much of the deck gone, to the point you can't really make out details, beyond the shape of the inner hull here. That mostly rounds things off here, but I'll share one more picture of this section, this one from further out. This shows the overall shape and condition of the hull, from the tower to the side, including some damage. Now for the only picture of the bow, which is a shot from directly ahead, showing the sharp angle. But not much else. The bow is clearly laying on its side, and the overall preservation matches with the rest of the boat. Everything beyond that is in the dark. So let's move to the deck. There's not much to cover here, but what is there is interesting. First off, because of the preservation of the wood. As you can see here, While it's certainly rotting away, much of it is still there, right down to the individual planks. More fascinating is the 25mm gun here. This is from the original survey. I-201 did not carry a traditional deck gun. Instead, the boat only carried two 25mm anti-aircraft guns. These were carried in retractable mountings to further streamline the hull, and you can see that here, with the shape of the deck around the gun, something easier to see on the Nautilus footage. Here we have where the barrel would go, with the larger square for the mount itself. As for the deck, the wood has rotted a bit more, but for the most part, there's not that much difference. Which brings us to the last two pictures. First, this one. Nautilus found a torpedo nearby. To me, this looks like a Mark 27, or as submarine crews called it, a cutie. For comparison, we have a museum piece here. And now the final image, a pretty ghostly shot of the submarine from up close. We can see the damage to the side, and the marine growth, along with the conning tower poking out of the darkness. It seemed a fitting image to end on. Though not the end of this compilation video. With the end of I-201, we'll be shifting to a much larger and more famous submarine, I-401, one of 3 massive Japanese subs scuttled off Hawaii, all 3 of which are quite interesting wrecks and boats in general, as I'll go over when we shift back to the old material now. In this case, the far more famous I-401. The I-400s were the largest submarines built by the Japanese. In fact, they were the largest submarines until the ballistic missile boats of the 1960s. That size came from an aircraft hangar designed to carry 3 floatplanes for attacking the American West Coast or the Panama Canal. Of course, no attacks of this kind would ever happen. The I-400s were commissioned far too late. By the time they joined the fleet, it was apparent Japan was doomed, and by the time they sailed into combat, the war came to an end. A fairly typical story for late war wonder weapons, no matter the country. In any event, I-401 was handed over to the United States, and eventually scuttled. We'll be looking at that in this video, after briefly touching on how she got in that position. As I said, I-401 entered service late in the war. The submarine was launched on March 11th, 1944, and commissioned on January 8th, 1945, at which point I-400 and I-401 began to work up and train, something they did alongside the slightly smaller Type AM class, I-13 and I-14. While this was going on, Japanese command settled on a new mission. Instead of striking the West Coast or the Panama Canal, the I-400s would hit Ulithi. They departed on this mission on July 20th, 1945. Various changes to the plan delayed the attack until August 25th, which, if you know your history, you know where this is going. While at sea on August 15th, the Japanese surrender was broadcasted. I-401's crew initially didn't believe this, but follow-up orders on August 18th canceled the operation. The boat launched her torpedoes and aircraft to destroy them before returning home. An American prize crew took over the boat on August 29th, 1945. I-401 was sailed into port, arriving back in Japan on August 31st. Although this only lasted for a couple months as American teams examined the submarine. Once they were finished, she was prepared for departure. I-401 would leave Japan on December 11th, 1945, sailing to Hawaii, where she arrived on January 6th, 1946, along with I-14. Both boats were studied some more alongside I-201 until March 1946, when the decision came down to scuttle the submarines. The United States government scuttled all their Japanese prizes to keep them and the technology out of Soviet hands. This would see I-401 sunk off the coast of Hawaii on May 31st, 1946. An American submarine hit her with 2 Mark 18 torpedoes, one in the stern and one amidships. I-401 reared up by the bow and sank by her stern. Her wreck was largely forgotten about at this point. The submarine was only discovered by the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory on March 17, 2005, at a depth of 820 meters or 2,690 feet. The wreck was found in 3 major pieces: the bow broken off like on I-201, and the main hull from the stern to a bit ahead of the conning tower, and finally much of the hangar broken off during the sinking. Ignoring the obvious damage, the wreck was found in pretty good condition. Relatively little rusting, and the major pieces are all recognizable. They were in 2005, and they still were in 2023 when Nautilus made a return visit. The same expedition that looked over I-201 also stopped by I-401. Unfortunately, not I-14, however. In any case, with the backstory covered, we can now look at the wreck. Just like with I-201, I'll be using material from both surveys. And where they overlap, I'll make direct comparisons. With that disclaimer done, let's start with the most distinctive part. Like with I-201, that is the conning tower. This is one of the clearer differences in quality between the 2 expeditions. Here we have a picture from the 2005 visit. This is very blurry, to say the least. Even so, you can still see the main feature, the I-401 marking, still legible after decades underwater. It's not quite as well preserved as the equivalent marking on I-201, but it's still there, and you can still see each individual part. The Japanese letter I and all 3 numbers, although the 1 is barely visible next to some torn plating. That's much clearer in the Nautilus visit. The higher quality footage shows the letters and the torn metal. There's no real change to the paint, despite this being 18 years later. The same goes for the hull in regard to rusting. With no changes to the submarine, what this image does best is just show it in more detail, from the paint to the rusted out upper level, and the rotted deck here. Something easier to see on both counts in the second image. More of the deck is visible along with the upper level. The damage is pretty bad here, mostly from rusting. On the lower level, however, the damage is far worse. Remember how the hangar broke off? You can see that here. There's nothing left but broken metal beneath the conning tower. Compare that to I-401 on the surface, and you can see how much is missing. It's not as easy to see, but there's also damage to the back of the tower as well. It's just too dark to make out. So let's move on. Back to the original survey. Here we have 3 pictures of the front of the conning tower. The first only really shows it from a high angle without much in the way of detail. You can see an open hatch and the periscope area, but not much beyond that from this angle. The second one is better in that regard. Again, the footage is very blurry, but it works for showing the general condition. From this angle, neither the damage or the rusting is very apparent. There's some rotted wood here and some debris here, but for the most part, it isn't nearly as bad. Well, if you ignore the bent periscope towards the top. We'll return to that later. The other notable feature, which you can see in the center, is the open hatch. I can't say if that was open before the boat sank or not. There's 2 different arguments here. that it was deliberately left open to help sink I-401 quicker, or that it was blown open because the hatches were sealed to more realistically simulate the sinking. It's hard to say for sure. Either way, the next picture gives a closer-in look. There's not much to say here other than the better look at the hatch and the deck, along with various scattered debris and a clearer look at the rusting. Unfortunately, there is not an equivalent look from Nautilus for this area. On the other hand, they did give us a good look at the rear of the conning tower. The first thing that jumps out is the marine life. There seems to be more of it in this shot, although part of that might just be the different angle. Either way, the tower is pretty overgrown here. For actual details, there's not very much. Some more rotting of the wooden deck, for example, along with the very obviously bent periscope, most likely a result of water pressure as the boat sank. You can't really see the bend in the next picture, but we do get a good look at the conning tower's upper level, and the periscope itself. That piece is in good shape, aside from the bending. The tower, well, that's not as good. The marine life is more apparent, but there's also a lot of missing plating. Much of the internal framework is exposed beneath the marine growth, and you can also see a lot of twisted debris in the darkness toward the bottom. However, since it's too dark to say much else, let's move on. From the conning tower to the stern. Much like with I-201, this area was focused on by Nautilus, but not the original survey, at least the extreme stern. So the following images come entirely from the later expedition. First, we have this excellent shot of the seabed. The stern is mostly intact here, with the shape clearly visible. That is helped by the almost total lack of growth on the hull, although the rudder appears to have broken off, probably from the impact with the bottom. There's also some broken metal up against the prop, something we see better in the next picture. That prop or screw is still shiny, despite half of it being buried in the bottom and the broken metal in front of it. And the prop shaft is in similarly good shape, although less shiny. It's still fixed in place with no apparent damage. Even the hull around it looks fine. However, looks can certainly be deceiving. This area is in good shape. That doesn't mean the stern as a whole is anywhere near as good. As you can see when you move up the hull, there's some severe damage here, both a break towards the bow and what looks a lot like implosion damage here. A lot of crumpling and rippling of the steel. However, despite the damage, the rusting is still fairly minimal. I-401 is damaged, but not falling apart. That allows us to see the detail in the steel that would have been lost if there was more rusting. The same story applies here towards the bottom. A lot of broken debris, and the hull torn open above it. I'm in agreement with the Nautilus video on the source of this damage. This is likely where the stern Mark 18 hit the submarine. It's consistent with torpedo damage, and a sign of just how violent those explosions can really be. Although that does wrap up this part of the stern, so let's move forward on the wreck and back in time to the original survey and I-401's deck gun. This was mounted on the stern deck just behind the hangar, as you can see here on the surface. It remains in place on the wreck today, although the original survey doesn't show it in much detail. We've got the deck gun here from a distance, pointing out to the side, which likely happened during the sinking. I can't think of any reason for the gun to be trained out during the scuttling, although I could be wrong. Regardless, it's pointing out now, which is good for getting a profile shot admittedly. This is a 14 centimeter or 5.5 inch single mount, which is fairly uncommon on shipwrecks, only really found on Japanese submarines which aren't surveyed often. So I-401's wreck is a fascinating look at this weapon, along with the deck beneath it, which is in rougher shape than I-201's deck, but you can still make out wooden planks. This is a decent quality picture, letting us see that detail. Unfortunately, the other picture from the original survey is not as good. This looks from above, and it's very blurry. We can see the gun mount from above, but that's about it, along with some of the deck without much detail. As for the Nautilus survey, we have an almost direct comparison shot here, from the same angle as the first picture from the original survey, just a little bit higher up. What I find interesting about this one is there's almost no difference between the two. It's a higher quality picture, but the actual wreck is much the same. There's no notable changes. 18 years between the two pictures, and it almost looks like they were taken the same day. That said, Nautilus did give us a better look from closer in as well. This shows the mount in much more detail, along with the marine life overtaking it. All the features are still in place: the barrel, the breech, and the training mechanism. They even give us another look at the barrel from the front. Although it's so rusted out, you can't see much beyond the overall shape. Either way, that rounds off this area, which leaves us one more to look at in detail, that being the hangar resting on its own. Here we have it in the original survey, looking at one of the three 25mm gun mounts placed on top of it. This shows the hangar resting on its side, with the gun mount laying flat in its original position. It's actually in remarkably good shape, especially considering the damage to the hangar, which, as you can see here, is in pretty rough condition. I'm honestly impressed the mount is hanging on at all. As for the mount, this close-in shot shows a lot of rusting. Even with that, it's still completely recognizable. Not much has changed there when we look to Nautilus, except for the orientation. Assuming this is the same mount, it's starting to tilt over sideways. Granted, it already was, but the angle is much more severe. The mount itself is in roughly the same condition, but the hangar has collapsed. Something very clear here. The metal is crumpling in on itself towards the middle. It was pretty badly damaged, and that's increased the rate of deterioration. It doesn't look quite as bad from this angle, but it does show how it's resting on its side, along with what looks like another 25mm mount here, although details are hard to make out. So let's round things off here, with the only pictures of the bow, which also seems to be on its side. The only notable features here are the rotted out deck and an open hatch. A hatch that we see from much closer in this picture, along with the rotting wood. It's a spooky image to say the least, even if you know that no one was aboard the submarine when she was sunk. Spooky or not, though, it will be where we round off I-401 as we move from one big Japanese submarine to another, from I-401 to I-400. Looking at the two sister ships together like this is arguably more interesting than it was before when they were in different videos. Not least because these two wrecks are in very different shape. I-401 is in pieces. I-400 is more intact, at least in the hull. The superstructure, on the other hand, is gone. And unfortunately, we have less detailed looks at the wrecks overall. I-401 was surveyed twice. I-400 has only been visited once. Still, as we shift back to the old material, I consider this one of the more fascinating shipwrecks out there. First, however, a brief overview of how we got there. If you watched my last two shipwreck videos, a lot of this will sound familiar. After all, many of the late war Japanese submarines share the same fate. In this case, I-400 was launched on January 18, 1944. and commissioned on December 30th of the same year. Not that much would happen when she entered proper service in 1945, because I-400 would spend much of that year on various flavors of training duty, most often with the I-13s and her own sister, I-401. There wasn't much in the way of excitement during this. Not that this would help her in the end. The submarine set sail on July 23rd on her one combat operation. This was targeted at Ulithi to try and damage the American anchorage. By this point of the war, any hope of hitting the West Coast or the Panama Canal was gone. Ulithi was a more realistic target, at least in theory. In practice, this raid came to nothing. I-400 continued on towards her target, only for word of the Japanese surrender to arrive on August 15th, and then formal orders on August 18th to return home. I-400 arrived back in Japan on August 29th, where a prize crew came aboard. The submarine would then be moored in Tokyo Bay on August 30th, 1945. She would remain in Japan, examined in great detail by the Americans, until December. On December 11th, this would change. I-400 was sent off towards Hawaii with other Japanese submarines, including I-401 and I-14. All three would arrive in Hawaii on January 6, 1946, where they would be studied some more for a couple months. The United States Navy was, after all, quite interested in these massive submarines, and the smaller, but arguably far more useful, I-201. This work would only come to an end in March 1946. On March 26th, the decision was made to scuttle the captured Japanese submarines. With Cold War tensions kicking in, the government wanted to keep the submarines out of Soviet hands. For I-400, this would see her scuttled on June 4th, 1946. USS Trumpetfish fired 3 Mark 18 torpedoes, sending I-400 down by the stern. Unlike her sister, we actually have footage of this easily available on YouTube. I'll link that in the description. In any event, this is where I-400's story came to an end for a while. The boat was actually discovered fairly recently in comparison to the other two I've covered. I-400 was only located on August 1st, 2013 by the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory, 11 years ago as of this recording. I-400 was found at a depth of 562 meters, or 1,826 feet. The wreck they found was rough. As I said, all the superstructure was missing. I-401 lost her hangar, but at least the conning tower remained. That is not the case with I-400. And in addition to the missing structure, the boat shows a lot of hull damage. Unfortunately, the pictures released of this survey are all pretty close in. We don't have much in the way of wide-angle looks at the wreck. Still, the pictures we do have are good to look at, especially for how much damage there is on this submarine. Now, since we don't have the conning tower, we'll skip over that section and move straight to the hull, starting at the stern. This is actually in better shape than an I-401, at least from the bottom angle. Both the dive plane and rudder are still in place and attached to the hull. You can also just barely make out one of the props behind the dive plane, along with what looks to be fishing lines draped over the hull. There's not much detail, but the boat looks fine here. That changes the moment you move a bit further up, where you start to see some of that extensive damage. In this case, a split in the hull here, where it's crumpled in and a bit broken as well. We can't see the full extent of the damage, but it's still pretty notable here. And that gets worse the further forward you go. Here we have the stern deck, which is torn and buckled. There's no remaining wood here, just broken frames and a hull that looks to be crushed in, possibly implosion damage. The article reporting on the wreck certainly thought so, specifically citing the buckled deck. It's hard to say for sure from these images. On the other hand, we can see the lack of marine life pretty well. Just like the other submarines, there's very little growth even after decades underwater. Goes to show that where a ship sinks matters just as much as how deep she sinks, at least in this regard. Regardless, let's look at the last picture of the stern. This shows a light post here, as well as the dive plane and prop here, along with a vertical section sticking up on the top. That was the secondary rudder for use when submerged, a feature on larger Japanese submarines that wraps things up on this area. We can now move further forward towards the deck gun. This was mounted on the aft deck, and is one of the few bits above the deck to not fall off. We don't have as good a look at this as the equivalent on I-401, but there are a couple interesting things here. For example, how this weapon is pointing out to the side. The exact same thing was the case on I-401 for whatever reason. There's also an open hatch here, surrounded by what remains of the deck. There's almost none of the wood left this time, and part of the deck just ends beyond the gun. We don't really get a better look at that, unfortunately. A combination of a lack of focus and the generally lower quality images, at least compared to Nautilus. In fairness, that's about what you'd expect given a decade of development and technology. Between the survey of I-400 in 2013 and the second survey of I-401 in 2023. That difference is quite apparent in this picture. From the other side of the deck gun, with a very blurry image. The shape of the gun is visible, along with more of the hull, but not much beyond that. That goes for this one as well. The lighting is a bit better here, so the deck is clearer, as is the rough condition of the gun itself. There's a lot more visible rusting here compared to I-401. Very little of the structure remains outside the breech and the barrel. That's likely a result of the shallower depth as the two boats sank at the same general time. It's certainly not pretty, aside from the vibrant marine life, although we can see more of the deck stretching out into the darkness. Not that we'll see much more of that moving forward. As we move further ahead, the next area is where the hangar used to be mounted. The image is blurry again, but you can just barely make out the framework, along with the curved shape. However, there's not much else to say here. That just leaves the bow as far as the main wreck is concerned. Here we have it, looming out of the darkness. The first thing that jumps out is how intact it looks. Much like the lower part of the stern, the shape is still recognizable. And aside from a cable stretched out over it, there's not really any visible damage. There's even a bit of the launch ramp here. However, just like the stern, this doesn't tell the entire story. When you move a bit further in, the damage becomes clear. This picture shows the center of the bow, along with the starboard side deck. The port side, on the other hand, is completely gone. It's not immediately apparent with this picture. The next one, on the other hand, shows it much better. This is looking ahead towards the bow, and you can clearly see the intact starboard side. Well, for a certain value of intact. It's at least better than the port side, because you can see it's completely gone from this position. About 50 feet is missing, including a good portion of the launch ramp. In addition to the obvious missing pieces, this damage also exposed one more thing, that being the torpedo tubes. You can see 4 of them here, along with a brief glimpse at the other 4 lower down. The I-400 design had 8 bow torpedo tubes divided into 2 torpedo rooms. Here we can see those rooms when the boat was intact. As for the wreck on the bottom, while it's not very easy to see, you can also make out the launch ramp. That's resting to the side here, where it fell off as the bow broke. The rest of the ramp isn't much better for its part. We have the remnants of the catapult launch ramp here. Even this part has split in two, with the bow slumping down to the side. There's some severe damage here, although this is still better than the conning tower. At least much of the ramp remains aboard the hull, even if it's broken and the deck is rotted away around it. That said, we've reached the end of the hull. There's only one more piece to look at, in the form of the aircraft crane. This remains in its storage position on the port side. With that covered, we finished off the deck. As for the debris field, there's a couple things here. For example, the remnants of the hangar. Starting with the hangar door. This fell off during the sinking and ended up inverted on the bottom, where, rust aside, it provides a good look at the internal locking mechanism. The hangar itself, meanwhile, is somewhat intact, at least towards the front. We don't have much here, but the shape is still there. Something a bit easier to see in this picture. The rounded off structure and the missing hatch make it clear this is the hangar, or what's left of it at any rate. There is some indirect evidence that the rest of the hangar is not as nice, in the form of two of the three 25mm gun mounts. This one, for example, is resting on its side. The barrels are buried in the bottom, and the rest is heavily rusted. It was clearly torn off during the sinking, taking even the base along for the ride. And the same goes for the second one, resting in a pile of debris. This one ended up inverted, showing the base and its rotating mechanism. Presumably the rest of the debris also came from the hangar, although I can't say for sure. On the other hand, I can say that we're looking at the conning tower here, or rather, the periscopes attached to it. The tower itself is out of frame, but the periscopes are front and center. This shows two things. First, that the tower is on its side, and second, that the periscopes are still attached in some way. Otherwise, they'd be on the bottom. Either way, that wraps things up. Just three more pictures. First, these two. I-400's bell was recovered from the bottom. You can see it resting in the mud here, and being recovered here. Last I heard, this was going to be displayed with USS Bowfin. If anyone has been over there, by all means let me know. As for this video, we'll end things here, with a haunting image of the gun backlit on the deck. It seemed a fitting place to round things off. That image was fitting for finishing off the I-400s, and it remains a good place to end the more famous Japanese submarine wrecks. However, there is still one more to cover, the last of the four, I-14, the far less famous predecessor in style but not in design to I-400, smaller but still quite large. Unfortunately, her wreck wasn't surveyed in nearly as much detail. Still, I went over as much as I could find in the previous video. And as we move to the old material again, you can see that here as well. With a side note that I forgot in the original. She was also sunk as a target, in this case by USS Bugara. That leaves the least surveyed of the bunch in the form of I-14. In comparison to the I-400s, I-14 and her sister I-13 are far less famous. Resembling a smaller version of I-400, these boats were the older design. I wouldn't call them a prototype. They're an outgrowth of the older A2 design, just with expanded aviation facilities. The I-400 was an entirely original design. In any event, I have a video covering I-13 and I-14 already, so I'll link that in the description if you're interested in the design and service history. For this video, we'll focus on the sinking and the wreck itself, starting with how the submarine ended up off the coast of Hawaii in the first place. If you've watched the older videos, well, this story will sound familiar. I-14 was commissioned on March 14th, 1945, and spent most of that year either in port or sailing Japanese home waters, dodging various air attacks in the process. This only came to an end on June 25th, 1945, when a plan was put together to attack Ulithi using the submarine aircraft carriers. In this, I-13 and I-14 would go first, exchanging their attack aircraft for scouting aircraft. The I-400s would use the information from those scouts to launch an air raid in turn. However, technical issues with I-14 would delay her departure on this mission. I-13 would, as a result, sail alone on July 11th, with the submarine sunk on July 16th, 1945. That aside, I-14 would sort out her technical issues and depart Japan on July 17th. As the submarine sailed to Truk, the boat was spotted by American forces. This would result in one of the longest submarine hunts of the war. I-14 had to stay submerged for no less than 35 hours, or if you prefer, almost a full day and a half. This drained the batteries and air supply, forcing the submarine to raise her snorkel to recharge. Fortunately for the crew, they weren't spotted. After continuing to evade detection, I-14 eventually reached Truk on August 4th, 1945, where she would remain until the Japanese surrender on August 15th. The crew jettisoned all their torpedoes before ultimately surrendering on August 27th. A prize crew was put aboard on August 28th, which sailed the boat back to Japan. At this point, I-14 would be studied by curious American forces. At first, this was done in Japan. This would change in December 1945 when the boat was taken to Pearl Harbor, well away from any potential Soviet attention, where I-14 would arrive on January 6, 1946. She would be studied further until eventually scuttled on May 28, 1946. Just like with the other three, this was a final metaphorical middle finger to the Soviets. None of these advanced Japanese submarines would be given over, with other captured boats, including I-402, scuttled off Japan as well. Regardless, I-14 was forgotten at this point. The submarine would only be rediscovered decades later on February 15, 2009. The Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory found the boat in two pieces at a depth of around 800 meters, or 2,625 feet. The bow had broken off and drifted some distance from the main hull, scattering a debris field of batteries between the two sections. Obvious damage aside, however, I-14 is in generally good condition. Not quite as well preserved as I-201, but not bad for her age either. Unfortunately, since this is the forgotten submarine, in comparison to the others, we only have that initial 2009 survey. That means fairly close-in photos instead of the more wide-angle looks that Nautilus gave on I-401 and I-201. There was a documentary, Hunt for the Samurai Subs, by National Geographic. Sadly, I've never been able to track it down. That said, there's still interesting things here. Let's begin with the detached bow and then move to the main hull. This is in good shape, aside from the part where it split from the hull. Here we have the very front beneath the submersible examining the wreck. It's a bit dark outside of those lights, so much of the detail is missing. The most distinctive bit is probably this here, where the dive plane would retract when not in use. You can see that better in this image of the boat on the surface. Aside from that, there's also crumpling of the pressure hull towards the bottom. The rippling is pretty clear. But without much beyond that, let's move on. First to this picture taken from closer in. Here we can see two things. First, the very tip of the bow, and just behind that, the boat's torpedo tubes, or at least a couple of them. I-14 had 6 bow torpedo tubes, but only 2 of them are really visible here. The third one on this side should be in this area, but I can't quite make it out. I'm sure someone in the comments will. That aside, there's not a lot here beyond the tubes. It's a good look at the hull with a relatively light amount of rusting and marine growth, especially for being underwater for 63 years when this picture was taken. Still, it's time to move on to the next image, which, in fairness, has even less to talk about. We've moved further up towards the deck where we can see the holes in the side, and a hull that's got the classic rough rusted texture. Yet beyond that is still intact. It's easy to see why the descriptions of the wreck note that, damage aside, the bow is in good shape. Or at least it was when the boat was filmed back in 2009. Something that's more apparent here with the dive plane. We have a much closer look at that opening this time, with the plane itself partially sticking out. That relatively thin metal is showing much more in the way of rusting than the thicker pressure hull around it. However, outside of that, I-14's bow is still pretty much clear. This isn't really surprising because the same was true on the other 3 wrecks we've looked at, as well as the mini-sub sunk by USS Ward not that far away in the grand scheme of things. A pattern that continues on the last picture of the bow, the boat's anchor still firmly fixed in place, without much else to note beyond that. A well-preserved anchor that hasn't fallen out. As such, let's move to the other end of the boat with 2 pictures of I-14's stern. Once again, there's not a lot of detail here. We have a nice look at the stern, from the upper rudder here, to the prop guards on either side of the hull. Sadly, we don't get a look at the props or screws themselves on this wreck. In exchange, we have a better look at the stern light here, which is intact, albeit covered in marine growth. The stern has more of that in general, but the post and the light itself arguably has the most, with the rudder coming in second behind it. Fortunately, as we move further up the boat, more details will be apparent, starting here with the conning tower. This is much the same as I-201 and I-401, mostly intact with the painted number still clearly visible on both sides of the tower, as we'll see. But we'll start here first. This appears to be the port side, judging from the lack of the hangar. You can see some of that superstructure towards the front here, along with an intact ladder, and a peek at the 25mm guns we'll be seeing later. All of that aside, the most notable feature is, of course, the number. This is a bit overgrown, at least on this side, but it's still perfectly legible. the white paint hasn't really faded at all, something that holds true on the starboard side as well. As you can see here, the designation isn't just flat white on this side of the boat. It gives it an interesting look, and with the relative lack of marine life, it's clearer to see in general. It's also where we'll end the side of the conning tower in favor of a brief look at the inside. There's not a lot of detail here, unfortunately, but it does do a good job of showing how, relatively, cramped the tower was. There's not a lot of space between the equipment on the side and the periscope mounting in the center. I doubt it would be much wider on the other side, but we don't see that. We do, on the other hand, get a look at the front. There's not a lot here either, aside from various equipment, including what seem to be speaking tubes here. Past that, however, we're nearing the end of the video, with 2 pictures of 25mm guns, and one of the hangar proper. Starting here with the triple 25mm gun, which is pointing straight up, although the mounting has remained fixed to the hull, or rather to the hangar. We can see that a bit here beneath the rotting planking of the deck, with part of the superstructure missing behind it, although the latter is still in place further back. The next image, meanwhile, is from much closer in. There's not a lot to note, however. The barrels are again pointing straight up, and there are fishing lines draped over the mount. But aside from some damage to the conning tower here, there's not much else. As a result, it's time for the last picture, and that's the front of the large hangar, which appears to have lost its door. There's no sign of it, leaving a gaping maw in its place, one that we don't get a good look inside this time. On the other hand, we do see a fair bit of debris to the side. I-14's deck seems to be in rough shape here, even if we can't see much of it. Regardless, that does wrap things up here. I-14's wreck hasn't seen the same attention as her more famous cousins, but the wreck still has some interesting features of her own. And I'll freely admit I have a soft spot for the more forgotten ships, or in this case, submarines. Right, that brings us to the end of this experiment. A long one. My first video to crack the hour mark, for better or worse. I have no idea what to expect from this. Hopefully it'll be interesting enough to get people to watch. If nothing else, it'll tell me if the idea of compilations or long-form videos is at all viable. So there's that. Either way, I'll wrap things up here. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.